Djibouti shouldn't matter. It is one of the smallest countries on Earth, roughly the size of New Hampshire, wedged into the Horn of Africa between Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. Temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. The landscape is volcanic rock and desert, hostile to agriculture at any meaningful scale. There is no oil, no natural gas, no significant mineral deposits. The population barely crosses 1 million people. Per capita income hovers around $2,000. On every conventional measure of national power, Djibouti is a footnote. And yet, right now, on this narrow strip of rock and heat, the United States, China, France, Japan, and Italy all maintain active military bases. Not embassies or trade missions. Military installations with troops, aircraft, naval access, and full operational capability. In several places, the perimeter fences of rival superpowers sit close enough that soldiers from countries in sustained strategic competition can see each other across the wire. No other patch of territory on the planet achieves this concentration of great power military presence. Not in the Cold War, not since, not today. A country with almost nothing became the one address that every superpower decided it could not afford to be absent from. Understanding why requires looking at the water just outside Djibouti's border, and at a problem that has shaped global strategy for 3 centuries. The Bab el-Mandeb, translated from Arabic, the Gate of Grief. The name has been accurate for a long time. This strait is the sole maritime passage between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. At its narrowest point, it is less than 30 kilometers wide. On one side, the coastline of Djibouti and Eritrea. On the other, Yemen. Between them sits a corridor of water that has shaped the economics of global trade for more than a century. The logic follows directly from how cargo moves around the planet. Any ship traveling between Asia and Europe by sea has two options. It can transit the Suez Canal, and to reach the Suez Canal, it must first pass through the Bab el-Mandeb and northward up the Red Sea. Or it can sail south around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks of transit time, and it's a significant fuel cost to every voyage. When freight markets are functioning normally, the extra cost is prohibitive. The Suez route wins, which means the Bab el-Mandeb is not optional. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through this corridor. That includes most container traffic between Chinese factories and European consumers, a significant share of Gulf oil's exports, and the majority of trade connecting East Africa and the Levant to global markets. 12% sounds manageable, until you consider that diverting it requires every affected vessel to add weeks of transit time simultaneously. Supply chains that run on just-in-time delivery cannot absorb that shock cleanly. Djibouti sits at the African entrance to that gap. Its entire strategic value can be stated in one sentence. Whoever holds this coastline can threaten the supply chains that run the global economy. But here's the problem. In late 2023, the Houthi movement in Yemen began targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea with missiles, drones, and sustained interdiction attempts that continued for over a year. Insurance rates surged. Major container lines suspended Red Sea transits entirely and rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles and tens of millions of dollars in additional fuel costs per vessel. The disruption was measurable and global. The response illustrated both the value and the limits of the Djiboutian address. 5 great powers with military bases there, equipped with carrier strike groups, advanced surveillance systems, and naval firepower, mobilized to protect warships and intercept incoming missiles. They succeeded in protecting military assets, They could not prevent commercial shipping from being effectively disrupted for months, which raises an uncomfortable question. If all that military presence could not secure the strait from a non-state actor operating from the Yemeni coast, what are the bases actually there for? The honest answer is that the bases were never built for this scenario. They were designed for a different kind of threat, one that goes back to the 19th century and has never fully gone away. France arrived at this location in 1862. The logic was clean. France needed a counterweight to British dominance of the Red Sea Passage. Britain held Aden on the Yemeni coast. French Somaliland, the territory that would eventually become Djibouti, provided the answer on the African side. What distinguishes this colonial origin from most others is what France explicitly did not try to do. There was no plantation agriculture, no extractive mining, no settler program. French Somaliland was a station, a place to coal and refuel steamships, base a garrison, and maintain presence over a corridor that connected France's existing empire across 3 oceans. The purpose was logistical, not extractive. The resource was the location itself. That logic compounded through the Cold War. Soviet naval expansion into the Indian Ocean in the 1960s and 1970s intensified Western interest in every shore of every strategic waterway. The United States and France both recognized the Bab el-Mandeb as a pressure point. Soviet access to Aden across the water made the African side more valuable, not less. Djibouti, under French protection, remained a Western anchor throughout. When Djibouti negotiated independence in 1977, the French base stayed. The new government understood what the presence actually provided: base rents, local employment, and a security guarantee that complicated any attempt by regional powers to threaten or destabilize the country. That guarantee mattered more than it might sound. Somalia collapsed into civil war in 1991. Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a devastating border conflict through the late 1990s. Djibouti remained stable and functional throughout. The United States established Camp Lemonnier in 2002. What began as a counterterrorism forward base for post-September 11 operations in Yemen and Somalia grew into the anchor of American military activity across the Horn of Africa and East Africa broadly. It remains the only permanent U.S. military installation on the African continent, chosen not for anything inside Djibouti, but for what the map says about everything surrounding it. Japan established a base in 2011 under a counter-piracy mandate and kept it when piracy declined. Italy followed. Each addition made the address more crowded and, paradoxically, more stable. Then, in 2017, China opened its first overseas military base. Not in a traditional partner state, not in Southeast Asia, in Djibouti. This was categorically different from economic infrastructure investment. Military basing implied a permanent commitment to force projection beyond Chinese borders and the defense of distant sea lanes. The People's Liberation Army Navy chose Djibouti for the same reason everyone else did. The geography is irreplaceable, the government is reliable, and the strait is essential to Chinese supply chains. Nobody had predicted that American and Chinese military facilities would end up a few kilometers apart in the same small country, with both governments tolerating the arrangement because neither could afford not to be there. That's not a coincidence. That's the geometry of the choke point doing what choke points do. And yet the military logic only explains half the story. The other half, the part that gets considerably less attention, is what Djibouti figured out about turning great power competition into a national business model. Djibouti understood something most small states never fully internalize. Location is a product. It can be leased, priced, and renegotiated. And if your location is genuinely irreplaceable, if you sit at the mouth of the one strait that connects the world's largest ocean to the world's most important canal route, you can run the transaction on your terms. The country built two parallel revenue streams from this position. The first is base lease arrangements. Camp Lemonnier generates tens of millions of dollars annually in direct rental payments and associated local expenditure. Each additional base, French, Japanese, Italian, Chinese, adds to the total. The aggregate represents a meaningful share of national GDP for a country with no industrial base and no extractable resources. The second stream is port logistics. The Doralé container terminal became one of the most capable logist hubs on the African coast, and its primary function is handling the trade of landlocked Ethiopia, a country of 120 million people with no coast of their own. Ethiopia has become one of Africa's fastest growing economies. All of its seaborne trade flows through Djibouti's port. China base deal illustrates the renegotiation logic precisely. China wanted access rights. Djibouti wanted infrastructure financing it could not generate domestically. That gap, Djibouti's capital deficit, became the negotiating lever. The result was a bundled arrangement: Chinese financing for port upgrades and a railway connection to Addis Ababa in exchange for preferential access terms and base rights. Djibouti provided the address. China brought the capital. Both sides got what they couldn't obtain elsewhere. If you're finding this useful, hitting like helps reach people who haven't found this channel yet. We dug through years of trade and lease documentation while researching this video, and one detail kept recurring. Djibouti renegotiates consistently and successfully. When U.S. lease terms came up for renewal, the rent increased substantially. When the French presence was formalized post-independence, Djibouti extracted ongoing financial transfers as part of the arrangement. The country treats military access the way a commercial landlord treats prime real estate. High demand, constrained supply, non-negotiable on the fundamentals. The constraint becomes the product. The geography no one else has becomes the asset no one else can offer. But here's where the elegant model develops a serious complication. GDP per capita in Djibouti sits around $2,000. Youth unemployment is structurally high. Infrastructure quality outside the capital and port zone remains poor by regional standards. The country earns rent from some of the wealthiest governments on the planet, and its population remains impoverished by most development measures. President Ismail Omar Guelleh has held power since 1999. The country ranks poorly on democratic accountability indicators. Press freedom is constrained. Opposition activity has been suppressed at various points. The rents flow into a state that faces limited accountability mechanisms, which means revenue circulates within the governing structure rather than producing broad development or economic diversification. Most people assume that countries earning substantial revenues from great power military basing invest those revenues into developing alternatives for when the strategic situation changes. The evidence in Djibouti's case tells a different story. The economy remains almost entirely dependent on the port and the bases. The rent has financed stability and elite consolidation, not structural transformation. What strikes us about this pattern is how familiar it looks across other contexts. Djibouti earns from geography the way Gulf states earn from oil. The resource is different. The distribution problem is the same. A state with sufficient external revenue to function without broad domestic taxation has weak incentives to develop the accountability mechanisms that domestic revenue mobilization creates. Rent captures the state captures the rent, the cycle feeds itself. Here's the take that will probably generate pushback: the criticism that Western governments direct at China's infrastructure diplomacy in Africa, specifically the argument that Chinese financing reinforces incumbent governments rather than developing institutions or economies, applies with equal force to the military base model those same Western governments operate in Djibouti. Both secure strategic access in exchange for capital flows. Both reinforce the same government. Both produce similar governance outcomes. The mechanism differs. The structural result does not. What do you think? Does it matter which great power is paying the rent if the governance outcome is the same? Drop your answer in the comments. The underlying principle Djibouti demonstrates turns up across a specific category of successful small states. Singapore had no hinterland, no resources, and no strategic depth. It built legal and financial infrastructure that made it indispensable to regional trade and became a hub not because of what it produces, but because of what transits through it. Panama had an isthmus between two oceans, charged transit fees. Switzerland had mountains that made it genuinely difficult to conquer, and centuries of resulting political stability. It sold neutrality and banking discretion to anyone who needed both. Djibouti had a strait. It charged rent on the map itself. Pattern is consistent. Countries that lack conventional competitive advantages sometimes find unconventional ones and build entire national economies around monetizing them. The constraint becomes the product. What remains unresolved is how durable the model is. Maritime trade routes do shift over long time frames. Global energy transition is already altering oil tanker volumes on the route. If Red Sea traffic were to structurally decline through sustained geopolitical reorganization, the value of Djibouti's address would erode with it. Country has made efforts toward diversification, primarily in logistics services and regional connectivity, but core revenue still depends on the strait remaining essential. One detail from the Houthi crisis that stuck with us: it took the simultaneous deployment of multiple great power naval assets to reduce, not eliminate, the threat to commercial shipping. That gap between the highest concentration of foreign military power on any single coastline on Earth and the continued vulnerability of the trade lanes is probably the most honest measure of how difficult the underlying problem actually is. Controlling territory near a choke point is not the same as controlling the choke point. For now, the rent payments continue. The government renegotiates. The port processes Ethiopian cargo. And Djibouti remains the one place on Earth where the United States, China, France, Japan, and Italy have all independently concluded they cannot afford to be absent. Will that calculus hold for another decade? Comment yes or no, and tell us what you think shifts it first. If you want to understand how geography shapes power and why the smallest countries sometimes outlast the empires that built their infrastructure, there's more where this came from.